It had been a year since Tanya's life took an unexpected, painful turn. Now, she could speak about it with ease, but in those early days, the betrayal was raw and left her reeling. Tanya, in her early 30s, was ambitious, smart, and beautiful. She was the proud owner of a small, charming cafe, had her own apartment, and even a little country house that had been passed down from her grandmother. Life was good. She'd worked hard for everything she had, and she never imagined that her own husband would be the one to tear it all down. Her husband, Mike, however, saw things differently. Despite the comfortable life Tanya had created, it wasn't enough for him. Mike craved excitement, something to stroke his ego and make him feel important. Although he had never truly achieved anything on his own, he thrived on the success that Tanya had built, always pretending as if it was his own. One day, like any other, Tanya and Mike left for work together. Mike worked as the procurement manager at Tanya's cafe, a position she had helped him secure. He would often finish earlier than Tanya, as she was deeply committed to her business and often stayed late, overseeing every detail. But on that particular day, fate intervened, and she finished early. She envisioned a quiet evening with Mike, a good meal, a bottle of wine, and some much-needed time together. Little did she know, her plans were about to be shattered. As she entered their apartment, she heard strange sounds coming from the bedroom. Confused, Tanya slipped off her heels and quietly made her way down the hall, her heart pounding. Opening the bedroom door, she was met with a sight that stopped her in her tracks. There, in her bed, was Mike entangled with a young woman she'd never seen before. Tanya, usually calm and composed, was flooded with a wave of emotion she couldn't control. She let out a yell, startling the two in bed. Mike and the young woman jumped up, scrambling to cover themselves, their faces frozen in shock. Without thinking, Tanya hurled her shoes at them, shouting, "Get out of here, both of you." Mike, clearly caught off guard, sat there with his mouth open, stammering, while his friend had the audacity to smirk and say, "Maybe you should leave." Tanya's eyes widened at the girl's nerve. "Excuse me?" Tanya demanded, fury surging through her. The young woman repeated, "You heard me. Get out of here." But Tanya didn't back down. She stormed over to the bed, pulling the covers off them both. Finally, Mike seemed to realize the gravity of the situation, quickly pulling on his clothes while his companion dressed leisurely, her smug look only intensifying Tanya's anger. Mike tried to mutter a weak explanation, but Tanya wasn't interested. She'd seen enough. The young woman sneered, "Why are you even explaining yourself to this woman? You have every right to tell her to leave." Tanya let out a bitter laugh. "Oh, really? And did Mike mention that this apartment is mine, from before we even got married?" This revelation hit the girl like a slap, and her expression quickly changed as she realized that Mike had nothing to his name. Tanya smiled, addressing Mike directly. "Looks like you found yourself the perfect match. But now, it's up to her to support you. As of today, you no longer work for me." The girl stormed out, throwing insults as she left, realizing that Mike's promises had been empty lies. Meanwhile, Mike's attempts to apologize fell on deaf ears as Tanya, with a firm resolve, showed him the door. In the days that followed, Tanya filed for divorce. Mike, left without a job, a home, or any savings, ended up moving in with his mother. He had spent their entire marriage living off Tanya's success, and now, faced with his own shortcomings, he would have to find a new path on his own. After the divorce, Tanya had hoped for a quiet return to her life, free from the turmoil Mike had caused. But just as she began to move on, she found herself facing an unexpected adversary, her former mother-in-law, Helen. Helen was an intense, fiery woman, and her loyalty to her son was unyielding, regardless of his faults. To her, Mike was a victim, wronged and discarded, and she saw Tanya as the source of his misfortunes. One afternoon, as Tanya was closing her cafe, she glanced at her phone to find a barrage of missed calls and messages from Helen. When she hesitantly returned one of the calls, Helen launched into a heated tirade, her voice dripping with indignation. "How could you just throw him out on the street like that?" she fumed. "After all he's done for you. You're just abandoning him. Tanya was stunned. She tried to reason with Helen, pointing out that Mike had been unfaithful and had brought the situation on himself. But Helen was having none of it. It's your fault he turned to another woman. You were too busy with that cafe of yours, neglecting him and your duties as a wife, Helen snapped. Tanya, usually calm and diplomatic, felt her patience slipping. Helen, he betrayed me in my own home, and I've done nothing but support him. I gave him a job, a home, everything he needed, and he threw it all away. But Helen refused to listen. To her, Mike's betrayal was a minor mistake compared to the injustice she believed Tanya had inflicted by refusing to forgive him. You're just going to leave him without a job or a roof over his head? Helen demanded. You owe him. After all, he gave his best years to you. The audacity of Helen's words left Tanya speechless. Here was a woman who, despite all evidence, believed her son could do no wrong and that Tanya was somehow responsible for his failures. Tanya ended the call, realizing there was no point in arguing with someone so entrenched in her own perspective. But Helen didn't stop. Over the next few days, she called incessantly, leaving long, accusatory voicemails demanding that Tanya give Mike financial support and even suggesting that she sign over a portion of her apartment to him. He deserves at least part of that place, one voicemail argued. After all, he put in so much time there. Tanya felt trapped. She wanted to move on with her life, but Helen's relentless harassment was making it impossible. Each call, each message, was a painful reminder of the betrayal and heartbreak she'd endured, and she couldn't understand why Helen refused to see her side. One evening, after a particularly vicious voicemail, Tanya confided in her close friend Sarah. They met at a quiet cafe, where Tanya vented her frustrations, her hands trembling as she recounted Helen's demands. I don't get it, Sarah, Tanya said, her voice barely above a whisper. I supported Mike, gave him everything, and yet his mother treats me like I'm the one who ruined his life. Sarah shook her head, placing a comforting hand on Tanya's shoulder. Some people just can't see the truth when it comes to their kids. She's in denial, Tanya. And if you don't put a stop to it, she's going to keep trying to manipulate you. Taking her friend's advice to heart, Tanya decided that enough was enough. The next time Helen called, Tanya answered, but this time, she didn't let Helen steer the conversation. Helen, she said firmly, I understand you're hurt, but this has to stop. Mike's choices are his own, and I am no longer responsible for him. I've moved on, and I suggest you do the same. Helen spluttered, taken aback by Tanya's firm tone. But Tanya remained steady, refusing to let herself be drawn into another argument. I won't be answering any more of your calls, she continued. Please respect my decision and stop contacting me. Without waiting for a response, Tanya ended the call, feeling a surge of relief. She knew Helen would likely continue to blame her, but she had drawn her boundary, and she intended to keep it. This was her life, her peace, and she wasn't about to let anyone take that away from her again. For the first time in weeks, Tanya felt a sense of control, a step closer to the freedom she deserved. Despite Tanya's firm boundary, Helen was undeterred. For weeks after Tanya's final phone call, the messages kept coming, now angrier and more insistent than ever. Helen seemed to take Tanya's silence as an invitation to escalate, sending messages that ranged from pleading to downright accusatory. Each notification on Tanya's phone filled her with dread, a reminder that Helen was refusing to let her move on. The messages were relentless, and each one was a painful reminder of the betrayal she had worked so hard to leave behind. Helen's accusations became more outrageous with every message. She claimed Tanya had stolen the best years of Mike's life, that she had forced him into a relationship where he felt undervalued, and that she had a moral duty to provide for him even after their divorce. One evening, Tanya received a particularly shocking message. Helen suggested that Tanya should give Mike a share of her apartment, arguing, "You owe him that much after all he's done for you. He may have made mistakes, but you're not blameless either." Tanya could hardly believe the audacity. Not blameless? She thought. She had supported him, offered him a job, and a home, everything he needed to thrive, and he had thrown it all away. Feeling increasingly disturbed by Helen's harassment, Tanya sought advice from Sarah once more. They met at Sarah's apartment, where Tanya poured out her frustration, struggling to hold back tears. "I just want it all to end," Tanya confessed, her voice shaking. "It's like she's trying to make me pay for something I didn't even do. I feel trapped. She's blaming me for everything, and no matter how much I ignore her, she doesn't stop." Sarah listened intently, her face set with determination. "This has gone way too far, Tanya. You don't owe Mike or Helen anything. They've crossed every line imaginable. You need to think about protecting yourself now." Taking her friend's words to heart, Tanya realized that she could no longer ignore the situation. Helen wasn't going to back down, her entitlement was only growing, and if Tanya didn't take action, it would never stop. She had been passive, hoping that silence would push Helen to leave her alone, but now she knew she needed to stand up for herself in a stronger way. That night, Tanya drafted a formal letter and sent it to Helen, clearly outlining that all future contact would be considered harassment and that she would pursue legal action if it didn't stop immediately. She made it clear that her divorce from Mike was final and that her life was now separate from his. Days passed without a word from Helen, and Tanya began to feel hopeful. For the first time in months, her phone was free from the constant barrage of messages. She could finally focus on her cafe, on her friends, and on rebuilding her own life, free from the weight of Helen's interference. But just as Tanya began to settle back into her routine, Helen reappeared with one last desperate move. One morning, Tanya arrived at her cafe to find Helen waiting outside, her face twisted with anger. Helen didn't bother with pleasantries. "You think you can just brush me off with a letter?" she snapped. "I won't be ignored, Tanya. My son deserves better than this, and I won't let you ruin his life without consequence." Tanya took a deep breath, standing her ground. "Helen, I made myself clear. Mike's choices were his own, and I'm not responsible for what happened. You have no right to keep harassing me like this." Helen's eyes narrowed, her voice filled with venom. "Mark my words, Tanya, this isn't over. You'll pay for treating my son like this. I'll make sure of it." Tanya watched as Helen stormed away, her threats lingering in the air. But instead of fear, Tanya felt a fierce resolve. She wasn't going to let Helen intimidate her anymore. For the first time, she understood that Helen's anger came from a place of control, a control that Tanya was finally taking back. Later that day, Tanya filed an official complaint with the local police, documenting Helen's harassment and making it clear that any future contact would be met with legal action. It was a step she'd hesitated to take, but now she knew it was the only way to protect herself. With the complaint filed, Tanya felt a renewed sense of strength. She was reclaiming her life, her peace, and her future, finally free from the burdens of the past. After taking legal action against Helen's harassment, Tanya felt a weight lift from her shoulders. But even with the newfound peace, she knew she needed a break from the chaos and lingering memories of her life with Mike. She decided to spend a weekend at her small country house, a place of solitude and calm that she had always loved. It had belonged to her grandmother, and Tanya cherished it as a quiet retreat where she could recharge. Arriving at the house on a Friday evening, Tanya immediately felt a sense of relief as she stepped out of her car and into the gentle, peaceful silence of the countryside. The air was crisp, the sky painted in soft hues as the sun began to set. This place was her sanctuary, where she could focus on herself and reconnect with the simple joys of life. Over the next few days, Tanya settled into a routine. She would wake up early, sip her coffee on the porch as the sun rose over the fields, and spend her days tending to the small garden that her grandmother had started years ago. Tanya had always found a quiet satisfaction in gardening, and now, with each tomato plant, each row of herbs, she felt herself grounding back into a life that was hers alone. One afternoon, while harvesting tomatoes, Tanya let herself reflect on everything she had gone through. The hurt, the betrayal, the constant drama, it all felt like a distant storm she had finally managed to escape. She no longer felt like a victim of her circumstances. Instead, she felt resilient, having taken control of her life and made it through the turmoil. The earth beneath her hands, the smell of fresh basil, and the weight of a ripe tomato in her palm felt like symbols of the growth she'd experienced. At the end of each day, Tanya would sit by the fireplace, wrapped in a warm blanket, reading a novel or jotting down her thoughts in a journal she'd found in one of her grandmother's old cupboards. She reflected on her journey and all the ways she'd changed. While there was still a sense of sadness over how things had ended, there was also a new appreciation for her independence and strength. On Sunday evening, as she packed up to return to the city, Tanya felt a profound sense of renewal. She promised herself to visit the country house more often, to keep it as her haven, a place where she could come whenever she needed clarity and peace. Driving back, Tanya looked forward to the week ahead with a new mindset. Her cafe awaited her, her friends were a constant source of support, and now she had a refuge in the country that she could turn to whenever life felt overwhelming. She knew that whatever challenges might come, she had the strength to face them. The tranquility Tanya had felt from her weekend at the country house didn't last long. The following Saturday, she decided to return to her retreat to harvest some of the vegetables and enjoy another peaceful day away from the city. But as she turned down the narrow dirt road leading to the house, her heart sank. She recognized a car parked outside. It was Mike's car. Tanya's pulse quickened. She parked her car a short distance away, hidden from view, and quietly approached her house. As she got closer, she noticed that the front door was slightly ajar. She peered inside, horrified to see Mike and his mother, Helen, rummaging through her belongings as though they owned the place. Helen had a basket filled with canned goods from Tanya's pantry, while Mike was stuffing bags with gardening tools and even a few jars of her homemade preserves. Tanya's shock turned to anger. Her home, her sanctuary, was being violated by the very people who had caused her so much grief. She had let go of so much, choosing peace over confrontation, but this was a blatant intrusion, a line she couldn't ignore. Without hesitation, Tanya stepped into the doorway. "What do you two think you're doing?" she demanded, her voice strong and unwavering. Mike and Helen froze, their faces twisted in surprise and, for a moment, guilt. But Helen quickly recovered, her expression shifting to one of defiance. "We're just taking a few things," she said, her tone dismissive. "After everything you've put Mike through, he deserves a few things from this place." Tanya clenched her fists, fighting to keep her anger in check. "This is my home, Helen. You have no right to be here, and you're stealing from me. Leave now, or I'm calling the police." Mike, clearly embarrassed, tried to pull Helen toward the door. "Mom, maybe we should go," he muttered, but Helen shook him off. "Why should we leave?" Helen sneered, her voice dripping with contempt. "You've taken everything from my son. He has a right to something after all those years wasted on you. You're the one who pushed him to this." Tanya felt a surge of fury, but she forced herself to stay calm. "No, Helen. Mike made his choices, and those choices brought him here. But breaking into my home and stealing from me? That's a crime, and I won't tolerate it." Helen opened her mouth to argue, but Tanya had heard enough. She pulled out her phone and began dialing. Seeing that she wasn't bluffing, Helen's face turned pale. She grabbed her basket of stolen goods and started pushing Mike toward the door, mumbling curses under her breath. As they left, Helen shot Tanya a final glare. "You'll regret this," she spat. But Tanya was unmoved. She stood in the doorway, watching them retreat to the car, her heart pounding but her resolve unshaken. Once they were gone, Tanya took a moment to steady herself, breathing deeply. She knew they could try to twist the story, to paint themselves as the victims, but she didn't care. This was her life, her property, and she was no longer willing to be intimidated by them. Tanya spent the next hour tidying up, checking her belongings, and ensuring everything was secure. She documented the incident, taking photos and writing down every detail. Her decision was clear: if they ever returned, she would have no hesitation about involving the police. This was her final boundary, and she was determined to protect it. As she locked the door and looked around her peaceful garden, she felt a renewed sense of power. The calm she had fought so hard for was hers to keep, and no one, not even Helen, would take that from her. The very next morning, Tanya didn't hesitate. She went straight to the local police station to report the break-in. She shared every detail with the officer, recounting how she'd found her ex-husband Mike and his mother, Helen, in her home, stealing her belongings without any remorse. She provided photos and her written account, as well as a list of the stolen items and the vandalism they'd caused. The officer listened attentively, taking down her report and reassuring her that they would investigate. A few days later, Tanya received a call from the police, notifying her that they'd tracked down Helen and Mike. The two had been caught off guard and had tried to downplay the incident, claiming they thought they had permission and were simply borrowing a few things. Tanya was furious but unsurprised. She knew Helen would try to twist the story to make herself and her son look like the victims. But Tanya's evidence was solid, and the police took her report seriously. They made it clear to Helen and Mike that any further trespassing would result in immediate legal consequences. They were also required to return every single item they'd taken and pay for any damages they had caused in the house. The day Mike and Helen returned her items, escorted by a police officer, Tanya watched from her doorstep, arms crossed, as they unloaded the stolen tools, preserves, and even the gardening supplies. Helen's face was a mask of resentment, and she barely met Tanya's gaze, while Mike looked thoroughly humiliated, avoiding eye contact altogether. As they finished unloading the items, Helen couldn't hold her tongue any longer. "You really had to go to the police for this," she sneered, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Do you feel powerful now, Tanya? Making a show out of something so minor?" Tanya didn't flinch. "Helen, you invaded my home. You violated my privacy, and you stole from me. You left me no choice. If you think that's minor, then maybe you're finally seeing why I had to set boundaries." The police officer intervened, his tone firm. "Ma'am, I think it's time for you to leave," he said to Helen, who reluctantly complied, throwing one last glare at Tanya before turning away. As they drove off, Tanya felt a strange mix of emotions, relief, empowerment, and a tinge of sadness. This was a final break, the closing of a chapter she had clung to for too long. But it was a necessary one, and she could feel the weight of months of harassment lifting from her shoulders. She had reclaimed her life, her peace, and her space. That evening, as Tanya unpacked the returned items and placed them back where they belonged, she felt a renewed sense of control over her life. The conflict had pushed her to her limits, but she had emerged stronger, resolute in her right to protect herself. She no longer felt like the victim of Mike's betrayal or Helen's manipulations. She had finally freed herself from their influence, standing firm in her independence. From that day forward, Tanya knew she could face anything. A few weeks after the break-in incident, Tanya received a notice that Helen and Mike were disputing her complaint in court. Unwilling to accept accountability for their actions, they had decided to challenge the charges, hoping to avoid paying damages. Tanya was both frustrated and unsurprised. Helen's determination to twist the narrative seemed endless, and Mike, who had always avoided responsibility, was following right along. On the day of the hearing, Tanya arrived at the courthouse with a folder of evidence. She had photos, witness statements, and documentation from the police to back up her account of the break-in and harassment. As she waited in the courtroom, she could see Helen and Mike sitting across from her. Helen wore a defiant expression, clearly intent on playing the role of the wronged party. Mike, in contrast, looked tense, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. The proceedings began, and Helen launched into a dramatic recounting of events, painting Tanya as the villain. "She threw my son out onto the streets with nothing," Helen claimed, her voice full of indignation. "We were only trying to retrieve a few things he was entitled to after years of sacrifice." Tanya listened, her patience wearing thin as Helen continued, distorting facts and turning herself and Mike into victims. But Tanya remained calm, knowing that she had the evidence on her side. When her turn came, she addressed the court confidently, explaining each detail of the break-in, the items that were taken, and the months of harassment she had endured. Then, she presented her evidence, photos of the stolen items, the police report documenting the incident, and even the threatening messages Helen had sent over the past few months. Each piece of evidence added weight to her story, and it became increasingly clear who was telling the truth. Finally, the judge turned to Helen and Mike. "The evidence here speaks for itself," he said firmly. "This was a clear case of trespassing and theft, and further harassment will not be tolerated. You are both ordered to compensate Miss Tanya for damages and any legal fees incurred. Additionally, any future violations of her privacy will lead to criminal charges." Helen's face flushed with anger, and Mike looked defeated. It was a clear loss for them, and they both knew it. But as they gathered their things to leave, Helen couldn't resist a parting shot. She turned to Tanya, her voice low but venomous. "You may have won this time, but don't think you've seen the last of me." Tanya met her glare without flinching. "You're right, Helen. I won this time because I stood up for myself. I'm done letting you make me feel guilty for living my life." As Helen and Mike left the courtroom, Tanya felt a profound sense of relief. This was the closure she had been waiting for, a formal end to the nightmare that had consumed her life for months. The court's decision was a clear affirmation of her right to protect her peace and her property, and she walked out of the courthouse with a sense of victory and empowerment she hadn't felt in a long time. That evening, Tanya celebrated with her closest friends, toasting to her newfound freedom and the strength she had found within herself. For the first time in months, she felt a weight lift, knowing she had taken back control of her life. She had finally put Helen and Mike behind her, closing a painful chapter and stepping forward into a future that was fully hers. With the courtroom battle behind her, Tanya felt a deep sense of relief that marked the true beginning of her new life. For the first time in months, she was free of the constant anxieties, confrontations, and intrusions that had disrupted her peace. She threw herself back into her work at the cafe with a renewed energy, determined to make it a place that reflected her hard work and resilience. Days turned into weeks, and life settled into a comfortable rhythm. Her cafe became busier than ever, and her friends and regular customers noticed the change in her. She laughed more freely, shared more openly, and her presence had a warmth and confidence that hadn't been there before. Tanya was finally reclaiming her life, and she could feel herself growing stronger with each passing day. One Saturday morning, Tanya decided to visit her country house again. As she drove up the familiar road, she was reminded of the peace this place had always given her, a true refuge where she could recharge. Pulling up to the house, she took a deep breath, feeling gratitude for the journey she had come through. The once haunted memories of the break-in had faded, and she was now filled with pride in how she had stood her ground. She spent the day tending to the garden, a quiet satisfaction filling her as she watered the plants, harvested ripe tomatoes, and trimmed herbs. The simple act of working with her hands brought her a sense of calm, a reconnection with herself and her life goals. In the evening, as the sun set over the hills, she sat on the porch with a cup of tea, watching the colors fade into dusk. The solitude and beauty of the scene reminded her that this, at last, was her life, a life on her own terms, free of the burdens others had tried to place on her. Later that evening, Tanya pulled out her journal. She hadn't written in it since her struggles with Mike and Helen had begun, but tonight, she felt the urge to capture this moment of peace. She wrote about the past year, the pain, the betrayals, the confrontations, but also about her newfound strength, resilience, and independence. As she wrote, she felt a sense of closure, as if each word was a release of everything she had endured. Today, she penned, marks the beginning of a new chapter. I've learned that my peace, my happiness, and my life are worth fighting for. And from now on, I'll protect them fiercely. Back in the city, Tanya began to share her story with a few close friends and even some trusted customers who had supported her through the difficult months. To her surprise, her story resonated with many of them, each sharing their own experiences of overcoming adversity. The cafe became a space where people could connect and draw strength from each other's journeys. Over time, Tanya decided to expand her business, adding a small garden-to-table section in honor of her country house. She introduced fresh herbs, tomatoes, and other produce grown at her retreat, bringing a bit of her peaceful haven into the bustling cafe. It became a symbol of her transformation and her commitment to building a life that was uniquely hers. As the months passed, Tanya's life flourished. Her cafe grew, her friendships deepened, and she found herself finally at peace. She had not only regained control over her life, but she had also rediscovered herself. The struggles she had endured were now a part of her past, a part of her story, but not a burden. She knew that whatever came her way, she would be ready, resilient, and unbreakable.